French Connection, The Conversation, Superman. Gene Hackman has died at the age of 95.
A front door left wide open. Two dogs wandering loose in the yard. And inside, a silence that had lasted for days. This is the scene that greeted the people who first walked into Gene Hackman's Santa Fe home on February 26, 2025, and what they found there would trigger one of the most closely watched death investigations in recent Hollywood history. Gene Hackman was 95 years old. Two-time Academy Award winner. A man whose face had defined American cinema for 4 decades, from the gritty streets of The French Connection to the villainous charm of Lex Luthor in Superman. He built a career on range few actors ever achieve, moving effortlessly between hardened cops, tragic outlaws, and comic villains, earning the respect of directors like Francis Ford Coppola and Clint Eastwood along the way. By the time he retired from acting in 2004, he had quietly slipped away from public life, settling into a private existence in New Mexico with his second wife, Betsy Arakawa, a classical pianist more than 30 years his junior. He filled his retirement with painting, cycling, and co-writing historical novels, choosing a life defined by stillness rather than spectacle. For nearly 2 decades, that privacy held. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, it shattered. According to Santa Fe County Sheriff Adon Mendoza, a maintenance worker and a security contractor arrived at the property for routine tasks and noticed the front door standing open. When no one answered, they stepped inside, and what they encountered set off alarm bells almost immediately. Hackman's body was found in a mudroom near the back of the house. Nearby lay a cane and a pair of sunglasses, suggesting he may have collapsed suddenly, perhaps mid-motion. On the other side of the sprawling home, in a bathroom, Betsy Arakawa was found on the floor near a countertop scattered with prescription pills. A space heater nearby had been knocked over. And in a crate in a closet close to that same bathroom, one of the couple's 3 dogs was found dead. The other 2 were still alive, wandering the property, hungry and disoriented. Investigators moved cautiously. In the earliest hours, deputies described the deaths as suspicious, less because of any visible violence, there was none, and more because of a detail that unsettled even seasoned professionals. The state of the bodies suggested they had been gone for a significant period of time before anyone noticed. That single fact reframed the entire case. This was not a couple who had just been found after a sudden medical event. This was a household that had gone eerily quiet for what investigators would later determine was closer to 2 weeks. A search warrant affidavit, later made public, painted a stark picture. Carbon monoxide poisoning was the first working theory, a plausible and almost merciful explanation for 2 deaths occurring so close together. Officials from the New Mexico Gas Company inspected the home's lines and appliances. They found nothing. No leak, no fault, no mechanical failure that could explain what had happened. Sheriff Mendoza confirmed shortly afterward that both Hackman and Arakawa had tested negative for carbon monoxide exposure entirely. The theory that had dominated early headlines was dead within days of being raised. With that explanation eliminated, the investigation shifted toward toxicology, medical history, and forensic timeline reconstruction. Detectives pulled phone records and pharmacy data. They reviewed surveillance footage from stores and pharmacies around Santa Fe, hoping to establish the last verified sighting of either Hackman or Arakawa. What they found gave the case its first real anchor point. Security cameras placed Betsy Arakawa out running errands, shopping, and going about ordinary tasks on February 11th. According to the sheriff, there was nothing in her movements or behavior that suggested distress or illness. And then that day, all of her outgoing communication simply stopped. That detail became central to everything that followed. If Arakawa's activity ended abruptly on February 11th, and the couple wasn't discovered until the 26th, it meant investigators were not looking at a single tragic afternoon. They were looking at roughly 2 weeks in which 2 people, and eventually one of their pets, died inside a home that no one checked on. For a man as famous as Gene Hackman, the isolation of his final chapter became almost as haunting as the mystery of his death itself. He had spent years cultivating a deliberately quiet, guarded retirement, and in the end, that same privacy meant no one realized something was wrong until it was far too late. Public speculation, in the meantime, ran in every direction imaginable. Some wondered aloud whether the couple had made a pact, a decision reached together in the face of declining health. Others floated darker theories involving foul play, pointing to the open front door as evidence that someone else may have been inside the home. But investigators were quick to note there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and neither body showed signs of trauma or injury. Sheriff Mendoza's team also pushed back gently on the idea of a joint decision to end their lives, noting that if that had been the plan, it was unusual that the two were found in separate rooms, on opposite sides of a large house, rather than together. The turning point came in early March, when New Mexico's Office of the Medical Investigator did something its chief medical examiner, Dr. Heather Jarrell, openly admitted was almost unprecedented. She held a public briefing to lay out the findings, stating plainly that the extraordinary public interest in the case required transparency that her office wouldn't normally offer. What she revealed reshaped the entire narrative surrounding the couple's deaths. Betsy Arakawa, Dr. Jarrell explained, had died from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare and often fatal illness transmitted through exposure to rodent droppings, urine, or saliva. It is not a disease most people have ever heard of, let alone considered a risk inside a well-kept mountain home. Dr. Aaron Phipps, a state public health veterinarian who joined the briefing, explained that New Mexico records only a handful of hantavirus cases each year, and that historically, close to 4 in 10 of those cases end in death. Arakawa's exposure point was never definitively identified, but the disease can progress with startling speed, moving from flu-like symptoms, fever, muscle aches, coughing, into severe respiratory failure within days. Investigators later confirmed that in the time before her death, Arakawa had been searching online for information about flu symptoms and breathing techniques, a chilling detail suggesting she may have sensed something was wrong without understanding just how serious it had become. Gene Hackman's cause of death was different, and in its own way, just as sobering. The medical examiner determined he died of hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a description of long-term, serious heart disease, with Alzheimer's disease listed as a significant contributing factor. Dr. Jarrell noted that Hackman was in an advanced stage of the disease at the time of his death, and raised the possibility gently that given his cognitive state, he may never have fully understood that his wife had already died days earlier. His autopsy showed no food in his stomach, suggesting he hadn't eaten in some time, though examiners found no clear signs of dehydration. Investigators believe Arakawa died first, likely on or around February 11th, and that Hackman lived on for roughly another week, alone in the house, before his own heart finally gave out around February 18th. The pills found scattered near Arakawa were later identified as thyroid medication, taken as prescribed, closing off any lingering theories about an overdose. And the dog found dead in its crate, it turned out, had a far more mundane explanation than many had assumed. Sheriff Mendoza revealed the animal had been taken to the veterinarian for a procedure just 2 days before Arakawa's presumed date of death, which likely explained why it had been kept confined rather than left to roam with the other 2 dogs, who survived on their own for the better part of 2 weeks. What emerges from the full timeline is not a story of scandal, conspiracy, or violence, but something arguably more haunting. A portrait of 2 people, one gravely ill and unaware of it, the other slipping quietly into the later stages of a disease that had already begun stealing his understanding of the world around him, both dying naturally, days apart, inside a home too large and too private for anyone to notice in time. It is a story that reframes the entire idea of Hollywood retirement, of the quiet, guarded lives some stars choose after the cameras stop rolling, and of just how easily that same privacy can become its own kind of danger. In the days after the medical findings were released, tributes continued to pour in from those who had known Hackman personally and professionally. Clint Eastwood, who directed and starred alongside him in Unforgiven, remembered him as a close friend and one of the most talented actors he ever worked with. Hackman's family, in a statement released through representatives, described him simply as a father and grandfather whose loss left an emptiness no words could fill. For millions of fans, he would always be Popeye Doyle, Harry Cole, Lex Luthor, Royal Tenenbaum, a performer whose range across genres remains almost unmatched in American film. But for the small circle of people who actually knew him in those final years, he was something quieter, a devoted husband, a man who had found peace away from the industry that made him famous, living out his last chapter beside a wife who, by every account, cared for him deeply until the very end. There is something quietly devastating about how ordinary the final explanation turned out to be. No conspiracy, no scandal, no villain lurking behind the story of one of Hollywood's most decorated actors. Just biology, age and distance, a rare virus that struck without warning, and a mind already fading under the weight of Alzheimer's, leaving a man unable to recognize that he had, in his final days, been entirely alone. It is a reminder that fame offers no protection against the most human of endings, and that even the most celebrated lives can close in near total silence. The investigation into Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa's deaths is now formally closed, its conclusions grounded not in speculation but in autopsy reports, toxicology, and forensic timelines painstakingly reconstructed over several weeks. And yet the case lingers in the public imagination, not because of what it revealed about wrongdoing, but because of what it revealed about isolation, about how even a life lived in the brightest spotlight can end in near total silence, unnoticed for days by a world that once couldn't look away. In the end, there was no mystery villain, no hidden secret waiting behind a locked door. Just two people, quietly failed by time, distance, and disease, in a home built for privacy that ultimately delayed the truth far longer than anyone could have imagined. What remains, in the end, is not shock for its own sake, but something closer to reflection. A reminder that the people we admire from a distance are, underneath the roles and the awards, simply people, vulnerable to illness, to time, to the same quiet endings we all eventually face. Gene Hackman gave audiences 4 decades of unforgettable performances, and Betsy Arakawa gave him, by every account, the kind of steady companionship that let him live his final years in peace. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of this story, not the mystery that briefly surrounded their deaths.